Hey guys, welcome to the topic analysis for Resolved. Wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. To start out with, I'm going to go over a couple fundamental definitions that you will need to have a basic understanding of the topic. The biggest issue is the definition of development assistance, so there are a couple of things that you should know. First is that development assistance has to be provided by official agencies, which means that any sort of plan that deals with corporations or individuals is not topical. Second, the main objective of development assistance is to promote economic development and welfare of developing countries, which means that any sort of plan that deals with some sort of external interest that a state might have does not constitute development assistance. Here is also some helpful classification of different kinds of aid and whether they do or do not count as development assistance. I think some of these would hypothetically make really good plans. For example, an energy development plan is something that you could generate a lot of offense off of, linking back to warming, or a research plan which talks about how we should gain more insight about specific crops or diseases that impact people within developing countries, because that is classified by the OECD as development. Things that are not development assistance are anti-terrorism and military aid. So if you see any sort of plan about how the United States federal government should increase funding to some other country's military, then that would not be a topical plan. Here are some potential issues that I see with this definition of development assistance, even though it is the one that's most commonly used. The first thing is, what is a main objective? So there are two ways that we could hypothetically view this. The first one is that as the stated intention of a policy, which would mean that when a government passes a policy, they would say that it has for the explicit intention of helping another country develop. The problem that I see with this is that it would potentially underlimit the topic, because any aff could pass a plan in which the government states that the intention is to help other countries develop, which doesn't seem to impose a limitation on whether or not the policy actually will end up serving that purpose, which means that pretty much any plan that has a clause about the state's intention being development assistance can become topical. Another way to view it is that we care about what the state's actual goal is. The problem that I see with this is that it just becomes very, very difficult to resolve what the state actually cares about when they're passing a policy, since states often have a variety of interests, especially since there are a large number of actors that exist. For example, with the imperialism K, it's a criticism of the way in which people say they care about development assistance, but then might have other goals that they prioritize over the interests of recipient nations. But this seems to put the aff in a weird position, in which case that wouldn't link to the aff, because that's not in the case of development assistance, because the state's goal isn't actually to help other countries, which seems to create a lot of complicated issues. The way I see to resolve this is that it's probably some in-between place between these two varying definitions, in which we look to historical precedent and things that have previously been used for development aid. So, for example, education programs or agricultural programs that improve the agricultural resources that the recipient state has, because those things are usually done with the intention of improving development. So now we're going to jump into some of the key positions on this topic. The first aff is the capabilities approach aff. So this aff says that it is necessary for us to have development assistance in order to promote freedom, but it takes on a different understanding of freedom than the kinds that you'll often see in LD. So substantive freedom is the idea of giving individuals the freedom to live a particular kind of life. So it doesn't just care about individuals having the capability to make choices, but rather what the outcomes of those choices are. So individuals have to be guaranteed things like access to resources and access to choices that enable them to actually end up living a valuable life. The things that I like about this aff is that it hijacks cont NCs, because it recontextualizes freedom not as something that just occurs negatively when the state doesn't interfere with you, but rather something that has to be positively guaranteed by the state. So that gives you a lot of leeway to make arguments in the one ear that say that, yes, we should care about freedom, but the NC just misunderstands what freedom is. I also think that this aff would be really interesting with an education plan, because education is something that is often necessary for individuals to figure out how to live a valuable life, which is something that the framework really cares about. So here are some key authors. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum are people that you should definitely look into for constructing a framework. You'll see parentheses next to different pieces of information throughout the PowerPoint. At the end, I have the articles that these pieces of information are from if you want to go back and look through them to start collecting evidence. Another key way that you would justify this aff is the idea of diminishing marginal returns. So this means that when an individual in a really wealthy country has $1, that money has diminishing marginal utility for them because they already have such a significant amount of money, whereas if that money was to go to someone in a poor country, it would do much more. So the argument here is that money in somewhere like the United States has a very limited impact on an individual's substantive freedom, whereas if you were to transfer that money somewhere like a developing country through development assistance, it would have a much more significant impact on their ability to make meaningful choices that define the way they live their lives. Here are some pros and cons that I think you will run into with this position. So the first thing is just that you can leverage it against a lot of NCs in a really compelling way. Since I think the majority of NCs will just make freedom type arguments about how individuals should not be coerced to give money to people in other countries. But this recontextualization of freedom is super, super persuasive. I think the position is also pretty intuitive. It makes sense that someone's freedom would be violated if they don't have access to basic resources that they need to live their lives, which means that you'll have a lot of intuitive appeal, especially when collapsing to something like this in the 2AR. The potential cons I see is that this is a consequentialist aff because it's a consequentialist conception of freedom. So all of the neg offense that you will see, such as arguments about how people become dependent on foreign aid or foreign aid will foster corruption, those sorts of things would be offense against this aff, so you'd have to be decently prepared on the util debate in order to deal with those kinds of things. The next aff, which I think is pretty interesting, is the development theology aff. So this is based on the idea of liberation theology, which is a theological philosophy which focuses on the oppressed and is super anti-poverty and cares about the dignity of individuals within society. And the way in which you would contextualize offense this aff is you would talk about the demands of solidarity and charity to individuals that are in need, because the framework has a lot of emphasis on the fact that we cannot just care about ourselves, we have to care about other individuals in society that may be suffering. It also talks about the need for reciprocity, which means that within an international system, if there are individuals who are receiving a lot of the benefits from the global system and others who are not, there is a duty to rectify that kind of injustice. Some pros with this aff. Liberation theology is something that a lot of critical theorists have written about, which means that you can construct the aff so that you have more frameworky and more critical versions that you can leverage the critical version effectively against critiques. You're also able to avoid some consequentialist turns through framing by saying that it's the idea of upholding this duty to individuals who are oppressed and giving up something that we have that they do not have, not necessarily about how effective the aid we're giving is. The cons that I see with the position is that you can definitely run into critiques, especially imperialism, since the idea of people just trying to go out and do good terminating an imperialism and subjugation of people in foreign countries is something that has happened a lot in the past. So it's definitely could be a persuasive negative argument to advocate that the aff is just another instance of Western imperialism. It can also potentially be difficult to preclude turns because the aff talks a lot about how we have to help individuals in poverty, so Ned can make some persuasive arguments that if the aff doesn't end up helping, that they don't actually have offense under their framework. So definitely, if you're reading this aff, you would want to prepare a lot of interactions in the 1AR that talk about why the aff is not consequentialist, and also probably be prepared to engage on the debate on the contention. The next aff, which I don't like that much, but you can read it if you want to, is the virtue ethics aff. So you would just read a generic Aristotelian virtue ethics framework, which talks about how we have to cultivate virtue in individuals and try to help them in leading moral lives. And then you would talk about how we can institute character building programs. So there's an article by Scott Thomas called Building Communities of Character, Foreign Aid Policy, and Faith-Based Organizations, which talks about how we can go into other countries and encourage community bonds and their involvement in grassroots kinds of organizations that help their character. The problem that I have with this aff is that it bites super, super hard into the imperialism the idea of people from the West coming into a developing country and teaching them how to be good people. And I think it's very rhetorically difficult to come back from that kind of criticism, given how hard the rhetoric of the aff is going to link into it. But I do like the framework, and there can be some interesting ground for plans. So I think something like a plan about investment in local grassroots organizations or something about education could potentially go well with this aff, but you have to be very, very careful in choosing an advocacy because the imperialism arguments are going to link in super hard if you have some plan that has historically been used for imperialistic purposes. The next Aff is the corrective justice Aff. So this also would use Aristotle, but would talk instead about the duties of corrective justice, which just means that if there is a situation in which there's some sort of distributional inequity or some sort of wrong that has brought about consequences that are still existent, it is necessary for the individual who has carried out the wrong to right the wrong. So this is in an Opeskin article, which I have the citation for at the end of the PowerPoint, which talks about how we should give development aid as a form of reparations because of things like colonialism and imperialism that have happened in the past, which have deprived developing countries of resources such that there is this inequity, and that reparations are a way of making up for that, or if not making up for that, at least a signification of the fact that the West has done something wrong. So pros for this position, it's super easily leveraged against critiques, because the argument is not that there are other people in developing countries that we have to help. So arguments about how development assistance is framing us as the white savior would not link to this Aff, because the argument is that we are giving them aid because we've done something wrong. I think it also goes well with plans, so there could be a specification of a particular country and something that the United States took away from that country, and then a plan about about a way in which we could give that back. It's also pretty easy to leverage against turns, because the argument is not that we are giving reparations because they are efficacious, but rather that it's something that we owe other countries, and that it has to be given back. I think this is one of the strongest Affs on this topic, and I would definitely recommend reading it. The only con that I really foresee is that potentially people could read a pick or a counterplan that picks out of some component of development assistance and just gives reparations, or some sort of topicality argument that says that development assistance and reparations are different things. But I think definitely you can frontline against this argument, so it shouldn't be that hard to beat back. The next Aff is a Rawls Aff. So you would set up a veil of ignorance framework, which says that we have to look behind the veil of ignorance and ignore particularities of our identities that would arbitrarily skew our evaluation of the world, and then make a judgment about what kinds of policies we think should be carried out. The caveat is that this will be different than the majority of Rawls frameworks that you've seen before, because it has to be in an international context rather than a national one. So the majority of Rawls frameworks will just be considerations of if you were another citizen of your nation, whereas in an international context, you were thinking globally. So you would say, I don't know if I'm going to end up being a citizen of the United States or some other developing country. So this would emphasize the importance of redistribution, because it would say because we do not know which country we are a citizen of, we would want the state to pass policies that would ensure my ability to live regardless of where I end up in the world. So here are some pros and cons I see with this position. The pro is that the impact calculus can be used to preclude turns. So you can read stuff about how it's about structural distribution and not about the consequences of the policy, because we care about the way in which society is organized. And you can read arguments about how the framework is not strictly consequentialist, which make it more strategic than just a generic utilitarian framework. There are a lot of noticeable cons, though, I think. The first is that the framework does not really make sense in a global context. So Rawls derives his theory politically because he says we need a basis for justifiability within a pluralistic society. So there are lots of people who will disagree with each other, but the state bases its policies in some sort of agreement or representation of the interests of individuals. So we have to abstract away from our particular circumstances in order to come to some sort of consensus that everyone would agree a particular policy is good or bad. But the state is never faced with the question of justifying its policies to the entire world, because individuals in other countries don't enter into the social contract at all. So it seems kind of tenuous the way in which the links that you would usually read to justify Rawls' framework would actually end up applying in an international context. The second argument is just that Rawls links super hard into ideal theory bad case. Most things don't actually link hard into ideal theory bad case, but Rawls definitely does, because it says that we are abstracting away from particular material conditions, and we're acting as if we lived in this ideal, but the ideal is something that is never actually a possibility. So a lot of abstraction-based arguments definitely would be pretty persuasive against this Aff. I also think the Aff is just potentially pretty turnable, because a lot of the arguments will just be about how individuals should have access to resources individuals should not be in poverty. But those are the kinds of things that you would actually need solvency about how development assistance is able to provide those things for individuals. So if people were to read turns about things like dependency, then that would definitely interact with the Aff. So you should be pretty prepared with impact calculus and with just generic util offense. But I probably would not recommend reading this Aff because I definitely think other things like the corrective justice AC are way more persuasive. So here are just some general thoughts that I have about fill NCs on this topic. I don't think that they're pretty persuasive because if the negative were to generate offense that just generally says the idea of development assistance is bad, the gist of the argument would just be that we don't have to help people, which is not an argument that a lot of philosophers believe, and is at least not a persuasive argument at all. The strongest, I guess, arguments would be stuff about freedom, but even those I see as not being that persuasive because of the limitation on freedom through something like taxation is just definitely outweighed pretty intuitively by the increased freedom for people in other countries. So I think that specific disadvantages and criticisms of Aff efficacy are way more strategic than the majority of fill NCs, but there are a couple of fill NCs that I like that I think could definitely be strategic to read. So the first one is the sovereignty NC. So the framework would just talk about how nations all have a right to sovereignty and that other countries have to respect that. The contention for this would be imperialism and dependency arguments. So there are a lot of authors that write about these issues because in a lot of cases in the past, wealthier countries have used development assistance as a means of gaining control in the internal affairs of developing countries through things like establishing systems of dependency such that they can manipulate internal affairs by threatening to withdraw aid. There are also paternalism arguments about how there is a power dimension that is inescapable in any sort of relation of development assistance, such that the recipient country doesn't actually have the freedom or sovereignty to resist the influence of the donor state. Then there are also arguments about how once the donor state stops giving aid, the developing state is unable to subsist independently because, for example, the industries within the developing country can become incredibly dependent on foreign assistance, which means that it doesn't have the capacity to exist as an independent state absent reliance on this sort of foreign authority. So pros and cons of this NC. Pros, I think that the contention is really strong and intuitive because this is one of the biggest criticisms of development assistance, that it isn't actually carried out for the interest of the recipient state, but rather that it's just another means of the donor establishing their political interest in a country that is weaker than them. And it also seems pretty persuasive that it is a very imbalanced relationship in which the recipient state doesn't necessarily have the authority to resist the donor state's control. The cons, I think, generally, it's just kind of a weak framework. It's hard to draw a line about the extent to which sovereignty is authoritative, because we can obviously imagine instances, for example, if there's something like internal repression in a state where it seems to be okay for there to be external intervention. And it potentially seems to be the case that if there are instances in which the government is failing to do what it needs to for its citizens by not providing them the necessary resources that they need to survive, that in not fulfilling its function as a state, other states then have the authority to step in. The next NC is the Libertarianism/cont NC. So you can have this in your toolbox. I think it's probably wrong, but it still can be strategic since the framework is pretty preclusive. So the gist of the argument is just that taxation is bad, and we don't have to help people that are poor in other countries because we just care about people that are in our country. So I like the framework, but the NC is probably borderline offensive because it just boils down to the idea that we don't have to help other people at all. And the offense is super, super marginal because it's just a really tiny amount of taxation that would violate freedom. And it's also pretty counterintuitive. So this is definitely the kind of NC that you can only read in front of a set number of judges, because if you were to read it in front of a more critical judge against a more critical Aff, the position would seem pretty outrageous and judges would feel uncomfortable voting on it. Now, this is not to say that I think it's like there's anything wrong with reading the position. I just don't think it's the best argument. The next iteration of the Libertarianism NC is to read it with a reparations counterplan. So the argument is just that we should give reparations, not aid, and that reparations are required under libertarianism. So this falls under Nozick's theory of entitlement, and which says that we have to have just acquisition before we have any sort of entitlement to use our property. The claim would be similar to the corrective justice AC, which is that we have unjustly acquired wealth through stealing from developing countries through systems like colonialism and imperialism, which requires that we give the money back. The claim here would just be that development assistance puts us in a position where we say we are helping other people rather than that we owe them something, which means that we should give reparations instead. The pros of the NC, I think it's a pretty intuitive position that's much more defensible than the regular libertarianism NC, because it doesn't say that we can't give up money because we have some sort of entitlement to it. Rather, it says that the money was unjustly acquired, so we don't have the entitlement to give it as a gift. Rather, we just have to give it back in the form of reparations. It's also pretty easy to leverage against critiques because it definitely has a critical lens to it, and there are a lot of critical authors who talk about why reparations are a good thing. The only two cons I see are, first, the issue of competition. So this counterplan maybe affirms, depending on the definition of development assistance. I think it's pretty defensible why it would compete with the Aff, because the definition of development assistance says that the stated intention has to be to foster the development of a recipient country, whereas the intention of the counterplan would be to make up for a historical wrong. But it looks a lot like a lot of common Affs, so that's definitely something. The permutation debate is definitely something that will become super important in a debate where you read this counterplan. And then because it functionally is a pick out of the intention of the Aff, in a situation where the Aff is giving some sort of direct amount of money to the recipient country, people could hypothetically read theory, so that's also something that you want to frontline against. But besides that, I think it's a very strong NC. So here is the bibliography. So just to briefly go through the function of some of these articles, all the definition stuff is pretty straightforward. The first and second definition are the things that list out different types of aid and tell you whether or not it's development assistance. For the capabilities approach Aff, the Peterson 4 article talks about how the capabilities approach would give us an obligation to give development assistance to other countries because it has such a small impact on substantive freedom here, but such a significant impact in other places. And then the Sen article would be used more for the framework side of things that would talk about why this theory of freedom is preferable to utilitarian or Kantian theories. So then for the development theology Aff, the first article can be both used for the contention and the framework. It talks about why poverty is so bad underneath the framework. It outlines how development theology works, and then it creates some specific arguments about the particular obligation the rich have. And then the Sherman 90 card is also something that you would want to use for the contention because it talks about the significance of poverty and development. For the virtue Aff, the Scott Thomas article talks about a particular model of development that would enable us to promote virtue in other countries. So this could hypothetically be read as a plan with a virtue framework, and then it has contention level offense. If you are interested in reading this stuff, I would definitely check out the SEP article on virtue ethics, and feel free to reach out to me if you have additional questions about where to look for virtue ethics resources. For the Corrective Justice Aff, the Opeskin article talks about the contention level and how that would play out. I would also definitely just recommend looking at this article in general because it sketches out a lot of the interesting philosophical positions that you can delve into. And for the Rawls Aff, the Opeskin article serves the same purpose in outlining the function of the contention, as does the Jackson evidence. For the sovereignty NC, the Richards 77 article talks about imperialism and how aid is just a mechanism in which donor countries can establish control in recipient countries, and talks a lot about dependency. And the Dubgen card talks about how countries' needs are never recognized within these sort of systems, and that it's only the interest of the developed donor country that ends up being promoted. And then the Libertarianism NC, this article talks about why reparations are necessary instead of just giving aid, and that the idea of aid is incoherent because it presumes that we have an entitlement to the money that we are giving to other countries, which we do not. Anyway, so I think this is a super interesting topic, and I'm excited for you guys to all delve into it. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to reach out to me.